The second area that I would say we need to perhaps develop a more comprehensive approach is on corruption and illicit financial flows in Africa. Africa loses $60 billion a year to tax evaders, to transfer pricing, to shell companies, and that are kind of hidden in offshore tax havens. The Panama Papers has brought this home very starkly, but it's a worldwide phenomenon, and Panama is really the tip of the iceberg there. Corruption goes to all three sets of interests. In terms of security, we know that trafficking in wildlife and people in arms and terror networks as well, corruption serves, the financial flows serve as means and motive for these groups. It also serves as means and motive for authoritarian leaders to stay in power because of access to financial flows. And it's not a victimless crime. If you say 60 billion leaves in illicit and quasi-illicit flows, the opportunity costs of that in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of infrastructure, that amount annually could be used to bridge Africa's electricity gap. 60 million is estimated as the annual gap for infrastructure investment. So what might the United States do in this area? Jeff talked about how difficult it is to do democracy promotion directly. It works in some places where there's an opening, and places that are quasi-democratic, the U.S. has an entree. It's much more difficult in places that are extremely authoritarian and that have shut down opportunities to engage with civil society. So the U.S. has to think a little bigger than that, and I think tracking corruption and financial flows can be a big part of that. The U.S. can be working with civil society, building institutions like the Economics Financial Crimes Commission type institution, investigative journalists, technologies and civil societies that allow citizens to monitor and track flows at the local and national level. At the regional level, the U.S. can be doing much more in terms of building capacities to track illicit funds with private banks, with governments, and with the international community more broadly. And finally, I think the U.S. has a lot of work to do at home in terms of fighting these illicit transfers. This is not just about corrupt African leaders, it's also about businesses and banks that ultimately hide these kinds of assets. I think the U.S. has a global leadership role it can play on changing the norms and the rules for transparent tax, beneficial ownership, and so forth. And I think we need to look to ourselves. The U.S. has insisted to other banks that they be transparent about U.S. Citizens parking money. But when other countries, Nigeria, have asked the U.S. to do the same, the U.S. has not done so. And I think if the next president, whoever she or he might be, wants to demonstrate kind of a global leadership and the credentials in standing up to big banks, tax transparency might be a good place to start.